Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today, thanks to channel viewer Jim the Coffee Guy, I've got a chance to review for you the Dan Clark Audio Stealth headphones. Jim's also asked me to send a shout out to Jeff from Hey Now Hi-Fi for making his purchase of the brand new Stealth smooth and easy and straightforward, despite it being a brand new product and coming from America. So thank you to Jim, thank you to Jeff from Hey Now Hi-Fi, and now let's talk about the DCA Stealth. And I'm probably going to say DCA a lot during this, meaning Dan Clark Audio, it's just quicker and easier. The DCA Stealth are a $4,000 US headphone, which makes the loan from Jim particularly incredible, so thank you again, Jim. And the other thing that's a bit unique about the DCA Stealth, in addition to the price, is the fact that they're the only flagship, super expensive headphone that I've ever seen at least, that can fit into a case like this. So these are a flagship, top tier, right up there with the best of them headphone that fits in a tiny, tiny case. Now often flagships are not headphones that you want to take around the place with you, but because the Stealths are a closed back, it does potentially mean that you could take them with you wherever you go. Now, of course, whether you want to comes down to how they sound, and we will get to that soon, but I think it's pretty cool that the DCA design for the Eon 2s and now also for the Stealths allows you to have a portable solution in such a compact package. And how that comes about, in case you're not familiar with the DCA products, is with this incredible gimbal system here. So the headphones have a gimbal that sort of wraps around them when you need them to be compact and portable, and then it folds out, probably clumsily because I'm doing it without looking at it, folds out like so to give you a normal sized headphone. So these are a full size headphone. There's nothing compact about them in the sense of them being an on-ear or anything like that. They're a full sized over-ear headphone with great comfort, but they're also very, very compact. While we're talking about this design, it also makes for a very, very comfortable fit as well, both in terms of having a synthetic suede and a synthetic or protein leather. But then on top of that, you've got this suspension style elasticized headband, which is also very comfortable. Now, one point I should mention when we're talking about elasticized headbands is that that's something I actually personally don't like to see on a headphone that I own, because I have had headphones in the past where the elastic has worn out over time and the band's gotten really sloppy as a result. In looking at the Stealths here, it appears it would be very easy to replace that headband, and I'm assuming Dan Clark Audio would make those parts available, so it's probably not a big deal, but it is something that I've had issues with in the past, and therefore I do prefer it when brands don't use elasticized headbands, but I realise it makes both the comfort and the compact design of these more possible than any other system. And so I personally wouldn't knock off points for that. As I said, it looks to me like they're very easily replaced if needed. And so instead I've focused on the fact that these are insanely comfortable, they're very easy to wear for long stretches of time, and they also look and feel remarkably well made. While we're talking about the design and build of these, the cups themselves here are made out of carbon fibre with, I think it was an aluminium frame I remember reading, which is bonded to the carbon fibre. It's a beautiful and striking design. It makes them light, but not overly light. They still feel sturdy and strong, and as I've already said, very, very comfortable. On the bottom of the cups here, we use these 4-pin custom style connectors. I don't say custom meaning they're proprietary to Dan Clark Audio, but they're not a particularly common connector. They are a very easy connector to plug into and remove the cables, but they do have a nice locking system. So I'm a fan of the connector. It would be nice if it was easier to switch cables from other brands that you might already own the headphones of, but it's not a deal breaker. particularly when we factor in the cable that comes with the Stealths. This is Dan Clark Audio's top of the line Vivo cable, and it's an absolute joy to use. With one caveat that occasionally I felt it was just a bit unwieldy. It's a little bit like trying to wrangle a lazy snake sometimes. It just wants to go where it wants to go. It wants to coil up a little bit, but it's not drastic at all, and it feels great in every other way. You can get these from the factory in balanced or single-ended connections. Apparently there was a mix-up in the ordering somewhere, so I do only have the single-ended here from Jim, but that's not been any problem for my testing because most of the time I'm running the Hugo TT2, which has a great single-ended output anyway. So don't think that's influenced this review in any way, shape or form, because it certainly hasn't. Beyond that, the Vivo cable here is a thick but soft-feeling cable. I believe it's got silver-plated copper conductors inside, but all I know is it's a beautiful cable that feels great, looks great, is mostly comfortable to use, and gave me no sense that it was holding back the sound of the headphones whatsoever. Putting down the cable for a moment, I want to talk really briefly about what's going on inside the Stealth that's a bit unique, but I'm not going to go into too much depth because I think if you're here looking at this, you're probably looking at other reviews too, and there's already some great information, particularly the head-fi introduction of these headphones that goes into the metamaterials used inside each ear cup. So what Dan Clark and the team at DCA have done is they've come up with this fantastic design that goes inside the ear cup itself between the driver and your ear, and it acts as kind of a series of sound tubes and resonance damping devices to help tame and reduce any issues with unwanted resonance, frequency spikes and the like caused by either the closed back nature of the headphone and or the resonance that naturally happens in the space between your ear and the driver inside the pad. So it's a fantastic piece of technology with incredible potential for its implementation in future models. And I was excited when Jim dropped these off to see if it produced a sound as exceptional as some people were saying. Rather than prolonging the agony with lots of technical discussion, I'm going to leave explanation of the metamaterial to things like that head-fi video I mentioned before. Do go check that one out if you're interested. And instead, I want to jump into talking about sound as quickly as possible. But there is one final thing to cover off before we get there, and it is somewhat related, and that is that there's no specs published for these in terms of the impedance or sensitivity. In my testing, what I found was that they sat pretty much dead center between the Meze Elites and the Hi-Fi and Susvaras. So for normal, comfortable listening levels, I was dropping back on the TT2 by about 5 notches less, so 5 dB down from the Susvaras, and another 5 or so notches down from these to get to the Elites, which means they're moderately difficult to drive. They're not crazy difficult beasts, and you should be able to drive them with most dedicated devices, particularly desktop and even more powerful portable devices should do fine with the Stealths, but I don't know you'd want to be driving them from a straightforward smartphone or even a small dongle with limited power. So do keep that in mind as you're looking at these. They are more of a desktop and full-size portable, so like a DAP or something like that. That's more what they're designed for. And realistically, with a $4,000 price tag and a flagship status as a headphone, you're going to want the best possible sources anyway, which most smartphones and dongles really aren't going to do. So do drive these with something with a bit of authority, but they don't need a power plant to run them. For my testing of these, I listened almost exclusively with the Hugo TT2. I did spend some time with the Soloist 3XP and the Soloist GT from Burson Audio, and those were being driven by the Burson Composer and the Schiit Yggdrasil OG version respectively. But as I said, for most of my actual note-taking and comparisons, it was all about the TT2 to maximise the quality overall, and also particularly because I was using single-ended. Something else I did to make sure that there was a really clear starting point when listening to the DCA Stealth was I listened to them for extended periods before making any judgments at all. And that's because I do recognise that I like a warmer, richer sounding headphone generally, which these aren't. And so I wanted to give them every chance to impress by allowing my brain and my ears to kind of adapt to their sound signature and settle into what they were doing. Now, maybe by saying that, I've telegraphed what I'm about to tell you, but what that's all setting up is the fact that I have to say I found the Stealths pretty underwhelming overall. I know some reviewers have been absolutely raving about these, talking about the fact that they're this new step in the evolution of closed-back headphones, but I can't agree. I came in expecting to hear a headphone that maybe wasn't to my personal taste in tuning, but was technically outstanding. And what I heard instead was a headphone that technically I respect a great deal. It's not a bad headphone by any stretch, but there's something going on with the sound that just leaves me lacking any kind of sense of engagement or enjoyment or any kind of sense of passion for the headphone. The sound from the Stealth is transparent and revealing. They pull out a lot of detail and information from the music, and they do, like many have said, produce a much larger sense of soundstage than a closed-back would normally do. But for me, that's kind of where the praise stops. I feel like the tonality from these is just a little bit dry, it's a little bit soulless and lifeless at times, and that's all despite it having a great sense of clarity. It somehow doesn't get across the energy and the excitement of the music. And I will talk about that more because I've already acknowledged the fact that they're not a tonality that I naturally am drawn towards, but then neither is something like the Susvara. And I put the two of these up against one another, being the Stealth and the Susvara, to see if it was just a tonality thing or if there was more going on. So we'll get to that comparison shortly, but I want to point out first and foremost, this is not about it being a tuning that I don't personally like. There's more going on than that, as I'll explain as we continue. Generally speaking, I'd say the soundstage from these has got good width, good depth, there's a good sense of separation of sounds, and yet there's also a sense of things being a little bit too tightly compressed together. It's really hard to explain, and I'm going to probably do a better job when I give you comparisons, because in isolation I was listening to these and thinking, everything's technically fine. Everything's not bad. The tonality's okay. Nothing sounds off. The staging's okay. There seems to be space around things. And yet no matter how long I listened to them, and I used them for my sort of daily listening sessions while I was doing my other work for about 3 or 4 days, and yet nothing ever really kind of clicked into place, which it normally would on a headphone, even if I don't like the tonality up front. Running through some specific test tracks, the bass weight and extension in general is good, particularly the extension. The extension's excellent all the way down to sub bass. But the bass weight was kind of interesting. It's almost like it comes and goes with the track, and that's not to suggest that it's about it revealing what's in the track, because those same tracks through other headphones like the Susvara, which are also very flat, provided a better sense of bass response. So I'm not sure what's going on here. I think the fact that there are some very gradual undulations in the bass response of the Stealths means that they do have the ability, depending on where the frequencies are in the recording, they do have the ability to sound quite lean or sound like they've got a little bit of body behind them. And whilst it's not ever quite to the level that I'd like it to be, on some tracks it was great. But then on others it sounded lean and kind of drained of any sense of body and weight and soul in the music. It's a very unusual response. A couple of things that the Stealths do really, really well though, is they've got a great sense of mid-range clarity when you listen to things like guitars, some vocals, not all vocals, because there is a tiny bit of overemphasis in the upper mids, but it's very, very, very subtle. And so in most cases, it's bringing you a sense of clarity and texture on things like guitar strings and strums and things like that. But it does occasionally leave vocals sounding just a little bit too forced. Similar to the mid-range, the treble quality from these is also exceptional. It's clean, it's smooth, it's very well extended, and my only complaint with them is that I feel like there's probably just a little bit too much treble, even though it's excellent quality, and it just does tip the balance a little bit too much into treble. But that's more a question of preference. That's not why I think these aren't winning me over, because as I said, there's lots of headphones that don't meet my personal taste, but I still thoroughly appreciate. The Stealths just didn't get there. And so let me now run through some comparisons to hopefully illustrate exactly what's going on, or I can't tell you exactly what's going on because I don't really know what's happened to cause the sound I'm hearing, but at least I can describe to you the difference between what I think are great headphones and what's going on with the Stealth. My most immediate thought when looking for comparisons for the Stealth was to go straight to the Hi-Fi and Susvara. Even though the Susvara is $2,000 more expensive, it's also a fairly flatly tuned headphone, and therefore I figured would give me a really good sense of whether or not it was just the sound tuning of these that wasn't getting me, or if there was more going on. As I said before, neither of these headphones have a tuning that is my personal preference, but I absolutely adore what the Susvaras do from a technical perspective. I don't reach for them for fun, but I do reach for them to be wowed and to hear a piece of equipment or a piece of music in a way that I've never heard it before. And that was kind of the same experience I was expecting to have from the Stealths. But in listening to a track like What If by Coldplay, what I found was the Stealths came across actually a little bit congested and closed in sounding. And that's after I've said before that they do produce a sense of space. So yes, they do produce a sense of space, particularly for a closed back, or maybe just for a closed back. In other words, maybe they're better than we expect because they're closed, but they really couldn't match something like the Susvara for overall sense of space. But there's more to that that's causing the Stealths to leave me feeling just a little bit cold overall. One of the lines of lyrics fairly early on in What If by Coldplay says, "Could put right what I got wrong." And when Chris Martin sings the right in that sentence, he really pushes it a little bit. And with the Stealths, that push on right was way overemphasized. It made me want to kind of pull back from the music, and not because of volume, it was something about the intensity with which that particular sound was delivered. It might have just been those particular frequencies within the tuning of the Stealth, I'm not entirely sure. But when I listened to the same passage on the Susvaras, they didn't have the same sense of overwhelm, I guess, that I got from the Stealths. With the Susvaras, I could still hear that that was the point of emphasis in that particular lyric, but it didn't come at me in a way that I felt like I needed to pull away from. So there's something interesting going on with the way the Stealths deliver the sound. I don't exactly know what it is technically speaking, but I don't particularly enjoy it. While switching back and forth, I also found that the Susvara had more energy coming through on sibilants, so sounds like S, T, and it was probably making it just a little bit overdone from the Susvara, and yet for whatever reason, I still didn't find them as kind of fatiguing and uncomfortable to listen to as I did with the Stealths. Now, I don't want to suggest for a second that I felt like I needed to take the Stealths off all the time. I could listen to them very easily for extended periods, but they were never a relaxed and easy listening experience where I was able to just get absorbed into the music. There was always just a little tiny sense of fatigue coming through, particularly if I wanted to turn them up for a very focused listening session. That's where I really struggled with the Stealths. While we're talking about that sense of kind of forcefulness and overwhelm from the sound of the Stealths, I found that when What If got a bit busier through the later sections of the track, I felt like things got a little bit busy in the Stealth. It all got a bit too much, a bit too forceful, a bit kind of crammed at me, whereas things were easy to listen to still with the Susvara, despite the fact that they're not a relaxing headphone. They're a very dry, very neutral headphone, but they somehow have an effortlessness to them that the Stealths didn't have. The Stealths were trying hard, they were pushing the music at me, whereas the Susvaras just kind of laid it all out there with full energy, with full clarity, but not pushed down my throat or down my ears as the case may be. The final thing I noted in this comparison was that, to me, the music coming from the Susvaras felt alive. It felt effortless, but energetic. It had a sense of presence and clarity and rhythm, and it just flowed very easily. When I switched over to the Stealths each time, it felt like the life was kind of sucked out of the music a bit. It wasn't bad. It wasn't like it suddenly became super boring and dull and horrible to listen to. But in comparison, I felt like I was listening to recordings through the Stealth, whereas I almost felt like it was the live, real thing from the Susvaras. Somewhere, somehow, the Stealths just lack a sense of life and soul. And so I put down the Susvaras and reached for a different comparison in the form of the Meze Elite. I chose the Elites because they're exactly the same price at $4,000. And I ended up writing notes on two different tracks when using the Elites to compare with the Stealths. The first one was High Water by Bob Dylan. This track is mostly acoustic and it's got those kind of dry upper registers from Bob Dylan's voice, and it really suits the tuning of the Stealths quite beautifully. And yet I still felt like things were just not quite right with the Stealths. there was that same sense of, I don't know if it's overemphasis, if it's the character of the sound, but just something that made the Stealth a bit unenjoyable for a focused listening session. I felt like I needed to turn them down and have them just as background music, and to me, that's not what you spend $4,000 on a headphone for. When flipping back and forth between the two, the sound from the Stealths made the recording of High Water sound just a little bit thin, like it was actually not a particularly good recording. Because I started on the Stealths before going to the Elites, that was sort of my reference point, and I thought, okay, it's not a great recording, but that can sometimes be interesting as well. Then when I put on the Elites, which are a bit warmer, but not an overly warm headphone, they're not like the Empyreans were. When I put the Elites on, I suddenly heard all of the music come through, including the lower registers. It didn't become warm and bassy, but now it sounded like what I would expect from a quality modern recording. There are some bass drums that come in just from time to time as an accent point in High Water. One of the particular instances is around about 206 or 207 into the track, and those bass drums lacked any sense of presence from the Stealth. With the Elite, they were there, they weren't overwhelming, but you could hear that it was a bass drum. Whereas with the Stealths, you kind of know they're a bass drum, but they don't sound like a bass drum because the bass doesn't come through with the right amount of emphasis or body or presence. But the issue with the Stealth isn't a lack of bass. Maybe it's a lack of bass in some recordings and not others because of what I said before about that slightly undulating bass response in their tuning, but I don't think the lack of bass is what's causing these to be an underwhelming headphone for me. If that was the case, the Susvaras would be the same. And so to try and help understand this even more, I jumped over to another track. This time it was Rhyme and Reason by the Dave Matthews Band. And when I put the Stealths on, I immediately felt like Dave Matthews was singing inside a box. Not because it sounded like there was boxy resonance, but it was like his vocal was separated from the rest of the sound and he was there in front, but in no way connected to the rest of the music. And that carried over something that I'd made a note about in my listening to High Water by Bob Dylan, was that there's this sense of vocals somehow being separated from the rest of the instruments. It's like there's a lack of coherency, but it's also not a lack of coherency, and that's where I start to struggle to describe exactly what I'm hearing. Something is just off about the way the Stealths deliver the overall sonic picture. When I moved over to the Elites listening to Rhyme and Reason, I could still hear that Dave Matthews was separated in sense of space around him from the other instruments. But he no longer felt like he was literally in a box and separate from everybody else physically. It was more just that he was here and others were spaced around him, as opposed to them all being lumped into one blob of sound. So I guess what I'm saying here is the Elites produced a good sense of separation, whereas it's almost like the Stealths over-separated things. Now maybe in this recording that's actually how it sounds and the Stealths are more accurate, but if they are, I don't really want to hear that. I like the way things like the Susvara and the Elites present the music with clarity and detail and warmth and soul, while still providing all of the sense of technicalities that I felt like the Stealths did, while not doing anything strange with the mix. So I can't say definitively if the Stealths are wrong and the others are right. Maybe the Stealths are right, but as I said, it's not something I want to hear. The final thing that stood out to me while listening to the Stealths and the Elites was that everything sounds a bit compressed and sort of flat from the Stealths, which is a weird thing to say for a flagship headphone that clearly has pretty good dynamics and resolution and clarity, but somehow everything just felt compressed and flat and like I couldn't relax properly into the music. It reminded me of listening to a heavily compressed piece of music from a recording point of view, but it didn't matter which recording I listened to. It wasn't about the recording, it was about whatever the Stealths are doing to the sound. Now I don't know if it's to do with their driver or the metamaterials or the combination. I'm not even going to try and speculate on that because I'm not equipped to do so. What I know though is that I'm not going to miss the Stealths when they go home. They're not a headphone that I have any desire to own in my collection, and personally I would actually choose to buy the Eon 2s over the Stealths because they're not as technically good. They've got their own issues as I discussed in my review of them, but I think that they're a more enjoyable and fun headphone than the Stealth at a fraction of the price. And so I apologise to any of you that own these and love them. I don't want to take the shine off your enjoyment of them, and if you enjoy them, that's fantastic. I'm just sharing my personal opinion. For those of you out there that know your tastes align with mine, I don't think you're going to like the Stealths. I have 2 patrons of the channel who've bought them and returned them for fairly similar reasons. And so I think these are a headphone that are going to suit a very specific person with a very specific taste. I don't consider them a safe bet for everybody, and I do think you should watch a bunch of reviews, do some reading, check out whose preferences you align with, and hear their take on the Stealth before you make that decision. They're a spectacularly made headphone. As I said before, I love the technologies that have gone into the physical design, the concept of the metamaterials, everything about these I respect incredibly highly. They just don't capture the fun and the joy and the excitement of music in a way that I believe a $4,000 flagship headphone absolutely should. And so I want to say thank you again to Jim the Coffee Guy and Jeff from Hey Now Hi-Fi for making this review possible. I'm sorry I haven't been able to say better things. I never like to say bad things about a product that I've been lent by a viewer or a patron or anyone like that. But on this occasion, I can't really recommend the Stealths. If me saying that has helped to save you $4,000 or maybe point you in a different direction with your $4,000, then please consider hitting the subscribe button and the like button. It really helps the channel out and helps me to continue bringing content like this to you. If you completely disagree with me, I'd love to hear some tracks down below that you've listened to the Stealths on that you think sound amazing. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.